Preface. Ethereal Hollywood is a world reconfigured from the golden age of Hollywood, where the legendary stars are not just memories, but immortal archetypes, still living in their own parallel alternative reality. Familiar history is not duplicated but flexible and constantly revisioning itself along diverse pathways. Time and space are also more fluid and less binding. And what has been called magic works in odd and unusual ways, producing scenarios from the silly to the surreal. And since these stories are in an alternative world or dimension, there are variances from real-world facts. Such as the relationship between characters, studios, events. This is a fluid world where history flows in unexpected directions. These are audiobooks with imagery synced to the narrative as much as possible, serving as quasi-storyboards to give a rough visual dimension to the stories. Book 17 of the Ethereal Hollywood series. The Architecture of Horror. Perpetual Prime Acres. The air in Ethereal Hollywood did not move, it lapsed. It hung heavy and amber, smelling faintly of ozone and expensive cold cream, perpetually fixed at that golden hour just before dusk when the light is both nostalgic and deeply untrue. In Perpetual Prime Acres, the suburban sprawl of the immortal, the lawns were always emerald and the white picket fences were sharper than razor wire. Here, the legendary actors of the Golden Age lived in their chosen prime, endlessly pursuing the next project or, more often, ruminating on past glories. But tonight, the atmosphere in the study of House 33, a meticulously styled Tudor home that seemed to suck the shadows out of the surrounding environment, was thick with grievance. Boris Karloff sat stiffly in an armchair upholstered in aged leather, his posture retaining the rigid, deliberate grace he had honed over 1,000 years of existence. Though he was in his robust, mid-career form, his voice, when it came, was burdened by the weight of diminished respect. "They laugh," Karloff stated, his resonant baritone slicing through the silence. "They watch our most deeply felt artistic expressions, the primal engagement with fear, the catharsis meant to purge the deepest anxieties of the human psyche, and they attach a sound effect. A whistle. A joke told over a canned beverage." He looked across the room at his assembled colleagues. Bela Lugosi, seated on a velvet divan, was vibrating with theatrical intensity. His face, eternally chiseled and brooding, reflected genuine fury. Lugosi understood, perhaps better than anyone, the sting of caricature. "The Count is a punchline," Lugosi hissed, his accent sharp and melancholic. "My very substance, the magnificent anguish of the predator, reduced to a cheap costume for a child's confectionery hunt. They have forgotten that we did not merely play monsters, gentlemen. We defined the boundaries of their dread." Lounging by the mahogany drinks cabinet, amidst the shimmering reflection of antique bottles, stood Vincent Price. He was impeccably tailored in a midnight blue velvet smoking jacket, his distinctive, urbane wit typically mitigating any situation. But even Price's characteristic elegance was strained by indignation. "It is worse than caricature, my dears," Price purred, swirling a small glass of something deeply violet and possibly toxic. "It is dismissal. They treat our work as a quaint, historical curiosity. Our monsters are no longer reflections of their own terror, but merely adorable anachronisms. The magic dies when the fear becomes cute." The trio shared a painful understanding. In Ethereal Hollywood, the archetypes were living, breathing, immortal energy sources. If the perception of their archetype shifted in the main timeline, the one that generated their collective memory, it affected their very being, filing away the potency that was their lifeblood. They felt thin. Karloff tapped a finger on the armrest. "The intent of creation has been lost. We strove for profound reaction, not amusement. We must re-establish the legitimacy of dread. We must remind them that true horror is the mirror in which they see their own decay." Lugosi straightened, his eyes gleaming with fierce purpose. "And how do we do this, Boris? Do we descend and take roles in their vulgar, blood-splattered spectacles? To sully the shadow with neon? No, Price interrupted, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. We are not going to join their parade. We are going to ensure that their parade, and their comfort, comes to us. We are in Ethereal Hollywood, gentlemen. Here, causality is flexible, and the boundaries between performance and reality are quite porous. If they will not show us respect, we shall reconfigure the reality in which they attempt to live without it. 2. The Vault of Archetypes. Price's personal residence was not merely a house, it was a curated repository of psychological menace. The central hall seemed to shift dimensions slightly as one walked through it, longer or shorter depending on the state of the observer's anxiety. They convened in the basement, which Price referred to as the chamber of unmade scenes. It was here that he stored the apparatus of his long, glorious career, not merely props, but items imbued with the very essence of the performances they had witnessed. Under the harsh, unblinking glare of a single utility lamp, the three men examined the materials. We need a focal point, Karloff mused, tracing the outline of a rusted surgical instrument, a remnant from an ill-fated mad scientist picture. Something that can broadcast the genuine frequency of our initial intent. Ah, intent, Price sighed, gesturing to a shelf crowded with spools of nitrate film, some crumbling into volatile dust. Intent, once established, bleeds into the timeline. Our intent was cathartic terror. Their current perception is triviality. We must force the convergence. Lugosi pointed to a massive, antique projector standing sentinel in the corner. It was unlike any standard device. Its housing was made of tarnished silver and strange, crystalline lenses ground from obsidian. This projector of perpetual gloom, Lugosi said, a tremor in his voice, was given to me by a particularly thoughtful medium in 1931. It was said to project the shadow of the soul onto the screen. Perhaps we project something far more substantial. Price nodded approvingly. Excellent, Bela. The projection itself is immaterial. What matters is the fuel. He pulled a small, lead-lined chest from a hidden alcove. Inside, nestled on black velvet, were three objects. A fragment of the original plaster mask worn by Karloff for the monster, still bearing the faint imprint of human anguish. A dried, crimson stain on a silk cravat, impossibly preserved, worn by Lugosi during his definitive performance. And from Price's own legend, a miniature, impossibly detailed replica of the wax figure he had created, the surface of which appeared to be weeping. These are not props, Price explained, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. These are anchors. They hold the residue of the fear we invoked, before the laughter began. The genuine article. Karloff approached the projector of perpetual gloom. His intellectual understanding of the dark arts, gleaned from countless scripts involving forbidden science and occult practices, gave him a certain gravitas in this quasi-magical moment. The problem with their world, Karloff began, instructing his colleagues, is their certainty. They believe they have categorized us, understood us, and, therefore defeated us. They think we are ghosts easily exorcised by historical context. We need to introduce the variable that cannot be catalogued, unsettlement. We require an act of metaphysical insurgency, Price added, pouring the violet liquid from his glass into a small, intricately carved bowl set atop the projector. The liquid did not splash, it seemed to sink into the silver casing, making the projector hum low and deep, like a dormant beast awakening. We will not frighten them with a sudden jump scare or a torrent of gore, Karloff finished. We will inject the suspicion of our presence into their comfortable reality. We will make them feel perpetually observed, eternally uncertain. We will replace their condescending laughter with cold, crystalline doubt. 3. The act of reconfiguration. The ritual began precisely at midnight, though in perpetual prime acres, the quality of the light made midnight feel less like an hour and more like an existential state. They positioned the three anchors, the mask fragment, the cravat stain, and the weeping wax figure, onto the projector's spool mechanism, threading them carefully across the focal lenses. Lugosi stood before the device, his arms outstretched, harnessing the intensity that had once mesmerized millions. He was channeling the archetype of the primal predator, the ancient fear of the unknown interloper. They believe they have seen the face of the monster, Lugosi intoned, the words echoing with the true theatrical weight of his eternal performance. They believe they have put a name to the shadow. But the shadow is boundless. Through me, the doubt begins. The certainty of the night is ended. The projector began to vibrate fiercely, emitting not light, but a cold, heavy wave of negative energy. Next, Karloff placed his hands upon the apparatus. He embodied the terror of miscreation, the sorrow of unintended consequence, and the scientific hubris that unleashes the unmanageable. Their science comforts them, Karloff spoke, his voice low and vibrating with immense tragic power. Their logic provides cages for their fear. We shatter the cages. We introduce the illogical variable. The moment when the human design fails and the result is magnificent, dreadful truth. The energy surge intensified. The utility lamp flickered violently, and the shadows in the chamber of unmade scenes stretched, becoming momentarily independent entities. Finally, Price stepped forward, his eyes shining with intelligent, macabre delight. He was the maestro of aesthetic horror, the architect of elegance and terror intertwined. He provided the necessary structure to the chaotic energies unleashed by his colleagues. Ah, perception, Price breathed, a delighted sigh. They have perceived us as harmless, as historical footnotes. We will revise the script. We will make the mundane unreliable. The shadows they ignore will acquire intent. The corners of their rooms will harbor observers. Laughter will catch in the throat, replaced by the suspicion that nothing is ever truly safe. Price finished the invocation by placing his hand on the obsidian lens, fusing his eternal archetype, the charming purveyor of menace, with the magic of ethereal Hollywood. The combination of the three archetypes, the primal predator, the intellectual monster, and the aesthetic sadist, focused their power through the obsidian lenses. In the reality of ethereal Hollywood, where the rules of storytelling and physics often overlapped, this was equivalent to rewriting a fundamental law of the main timeline. A silent, invisible beam of pure, refined dread launched from the projector of perpetual gloom. It was not aimed at a specific person or place, but at the collective consciousness of the timeline that had mocked them. It aimed to revise the emotional valence attached to their cinematic legacy. The air in perpetual prime acres momentarily froze, the smell of ozone sharpening into the metallic tang of fear. IV. The first tremor. In the main timeline, in a comfortable, brightly lit living room in suburban Ohio, a young man named Todd was watching a late-night cable movie marathon. The feature currently playing was a heavily edited version of one of Karloff's early, defining performances. Todd was texting a friend, occasionally chuckling at the quaint special effects and the over-the-top acting. He typed, "OMG, the fake bolt of lightning, the guy looks like he has a square head, it's hilarious." He paused to take a large gulp of soda, settling deeper into his couch. But then, something shifted. The scene on the screen, the moment the monster first rises, a moment Todd had always found amusingly clumsy, suddenly looked different. The lighting didn't seem cheap, it seemed intentional, oppressive. The anguish in Karloff's eyes, magnified by the cinematic focus, was no longer theatrical, it was real. A profound, heartbreaking sorrow mixed with a terrible, unhinged power. The image on the screen, which had always been a flat representation of history, became three-dimensional, vibrating with a palpable, threatening energy. Todd's laughter died in his chest. He felt cold, despite the warmth of the room. It wasn't the shock of a sudden noise, but a deep, unsettling conviction that the thing on the screen was not an actor, but a genuine, tormented entity. He suddenly looked away from the television, startled not by what he saw, but by what he felt. The shadow in the corner of his living room, next to the familiar bookshelf, was too sharp. It seemed heavier than it should be, a pool of pure blackness that refused to be penetrated by the overhead lamp. He remembered reading an article online just hours ago, arguing that these classic horror films were silly and harmless. Now, the harmlessness seemed like the greatest lie of all. Todd stood up, intending to turn off the television. The image of Karloff's tragic face burned into his vision. He took a step toward the wall switch, but stopped abruptly. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had disturbed someone. He listened. The neighborhood was silent, save for the distant, innocuous wail of a police siren. But the silence in his own house was wrong. It was the silence before someone speaks your name from the dark. He looked back at the shadow near the bookshelf. Was it closer? Todd swallowed, his throat dry. He hadn't been afraid of horror movies since he was a child. He understood the mechanism, the psychology. He was certain. But the fear that gripped him now was not of a jump scare. It was existential. It was the sudden, awful realization that the comfortable architecture of his reality, the certainty, the categorization, the predictability, had been subtly, fundamentally compromised. He didn't turn off the TV. He stared at the shadow, which seemed to be waiting patiently. They have lost respect, the collective energy of the three legends whispered across the flexible boundaries of reality. Then we shall reclaim the reverence of pure, distilled fear. In perpetual prime acres, the projector of perpetual gloom powered down. Vincent Price smiled, a look of profound artistic satisfaction washing over his features. "Ah, there it is," he murmured, swirling the residue in the obsidian cup. "The sweet, invigorating taste of genuine dread. It seems, gentlemen, that our reputation is about to experience a most unpleasant, yet necessary, revision." Karloff and Lugosi nodded. The power was rushing back into their archetypes, filling the void left by centuries of mockery. They were not merely actors in a joke, they were the immortal custodians of the collective subconscious, and they had just reminded the world that some legends should never be treated lightly. The work had only just begun. The slow, creeping uncertainty, the architecture of eternal suspicion, was now loose in the world, filtering into the spaces between the familiar. And every time someone felt that cold, inexplicable ripple of unease, they would remember the shadows and the faces that owned them. The laughter was gone, replaced by a profound, chilling respect.